Good evening and welcome. I'm Frank Dorr and I'm a volunteer with the steering group of Elders for Earth, which, as many of you will know, is a section of SHEP Earth Aware. This is the fourth in our series on spirituality and the earth. The series aims to have speakers from a variety of spiritual traditions and approaches explore from their own personal perspective how they see our relation to the earth at this time of climate and biodiversity emergence. For those joining us for the first time, you're especially welcome. And for those who were with us for earlier sessions, a big welcome back after the summer. And what a summer. No one who gave even a glance at the headlines over the last few months can doubt that climate change and the accompanying biodiversity loss is no longer just a future threat. It has clearly arrived as a present reality. For many people in the global south, of course, it arrived a long time ago, but now it has clearly arrived in the rich world. And it's not just knocking at our doors, but it's beginning to knock them down. And it's clear too that there are so many tipping points that we're on the verge of. And any one of those, not to mention their interaction, may bring the supply chains we depend on crashing down around us, and with them, the other sustaining structures of the society we live in. You'd think that if an invading enemy had already landed, we might expect that all our resources would be mobilized for action. But it's hard to see any real sense of urgency in most people or in our government. To a great extent, we just carry on with business as usual. Our approach seems to be, help us change, O Lord, but not just yet. And so it's clear that awareness raising is still necessary. And Elders for Earth is one of the many groups seeking to raise awareness of the urgency of the situation. As our title suggests, Elders for Earth looks to older people to take seriously the role of being elders of the tribe. Since maybe we older people may not be so caught up in the busyness of life as those struggling with careers and child rearing. So we seek to encourage each other to channel whatever experience and wisdom we've gained over the years into action. And not only into personal change, but into a clear call for changing the consumer culture and the social and economic system that have brought us to this crisis. As elders, then, we see a need to be activists. Greta Thunberg said to politicians, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." We want to take her words seriously and avoid a simplistic optimism that thinks that everything will be okay. But if we are to be able to sustain ourselves and each other, we believe that we also need to cultivate the inner resources that can enable us to face without despair the horror of what's happening and of what's coming. We need to find a way of awakening and nurturing in ourselves and in each other the love of the earth, awe at the mystery of the universe and of the web of life on earth, and compassion for all those who are suffering. And we need to support each other in a commitment to act in as just and sustainable a way as we can manage, while living within an unjust and unsustainable system. There is a Buddhist story that many of you will know. It's known as the Shambhala prophecy, and it speaks of the need at this time for warriors who are armed only with the two weapons of insight and compassion. In putting on this series on spirituality and the earth, Elders for Earth is seeking to help us equip ourselves with these two strengths. not so that we can withdraw from the world or ascend to any kind of nirvana, but so that we can be more effective activists and agents of change. Tonight, Terry O'Sullivan, another of our volunteers, will introduce our speaker, the very well-known artist Dorothy Cross. But just before that, I want to say a big thank you to the two volunteers managing the technology tonight, Alan Gray and Mary Cunningham. So now I hand you over to Terry to introduce Dorothy.
Thank you, Frank. Indeed, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dorothy. I've been looking forward to this talk very much. And just to welcome Dorothy, and just to give a little bit of a background to Dorothy, just to give you an idea of where she's coming from, those who are listening. So Dorothy was born in Cork in the mid-50s. She began her career in the Crawford Municipal School of Art. She went on to study at Leicester Polytechnic, England, and at the San Francisco Art Institute, California. Dorothy returned to Ireland in the mid-80s to continue her work in sculpture, photography, video, and installation. She's considered one of Ireland's leading contemporary artists and has exhibited extensively in Ireland and internationally. In 1993, Dorothy represented Ireland at the prestigious Venice Biennale. Dorothy lives in a beautiful natural part of Connemara, close to the sea, with which she has a strong connection since her childhood, with the sea that is, because Dorothy was a competitive swimmer, quite a strong competitive swimmer in her early days, earlier and not so early as well, maybe, possibly. And I know she still swims a lot and loves the sea. As part of the 2020 Sustainability Week, in an interview with Des O'Driscoll of the Irish Examiner, he described Dorothy as an artist with a strong connection with nature, and added that her work displays a deep connection with native and natural themes. Dorothy examines complex relationships between living beings and the natural world. Another quote from an exhibition she held, from a review of an exhibition she held in Dublin. Dorothy was given an honorary doctorate, if I'm right, I think I have that right, by UCC, which was a great, I'm sure, a great privilege. When Dorothy was invited to be a guest speaker for tonight, for the series, she expressed an appreciation for the challenge to speak about her work in a new context, especially under the title of spirituality, which in her words should be essential to all art in some ways. I was reminded of a quote from the Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky, in which he said that the artist must train not only his eye, but also his soul. So without any further ado, I hand you over to Dorothy and we give her a very, very warm welcome. Delighted to have her here tonight. Thank you. Dorothy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you all for inviting me. And it is an unexpected pleasure and challenge to try and locate, you know, what you do every day of your life, what ends up in galleries and museums, and see it in another context. And it's actually a little bit like seeing a piece of work move away from its original location, and how the way we speak about art can change its significance. What I feel about art in general, and it's when Terry first invited me to speak, I thought I would start delving into my favorite artists, you know, going from icons in Russia to Giuseppe Pannoni in Italy, a contemporary artist. And then I actually thought that would be too wide. And also the work I have done over the past 30 years is very varied. So it's probably more appropriate to try and speak about the works I've made of my own works. So what I've done is selected, made just around 30 images to talk about. And I'm very happy to have questions at the end, because questions make me know the work in a whole. It's like another facet in the diamond. Because art isn't about one meaning, it's about multiple meaning. And it can never be tied down. It's always in movement, and that's why it's so exciting. but also the limitations are that we are at this point in time in our own bodies. And so all references are to do with the physical that might leap out into territories that are impossible to depict. So the main thing in visual art is obviously the eye, but then you go into the head and the heart. But how you manifest, for me, is very different than a lot of other artists. Like, I don't try and manifest the landscape. I live in the middle of one of the most beautiful places. I might turn I wonder, can you see a mountain out there? Mm-hmm. You know, the ocean and the mountain, Wheelwray Mountain in Mayo, are right outside the window. And people say that must be an amazing inspiration for making art. And I would say, actually, on the contrary, it's more a balm for the soul. It's what keeps me calm when I go into the entanglement of the studio or traveling with galleries and things like that. So I'm not the most patient person in the world. I was very lucky that I came from a family that encouraged art. My mother and father in Cork, way back in the 50s and 60s, said, you can do whatever you like so long as you're happy. So I was one of those amazingly privileged people, because I used to teach a little bit. Now I do this hit and run nomadic teaching occasionally in institutions. And I see young people struggling more and more, actually, with the permission to be an artist. And I think even the use of the word artist in Ireland is impeded. In some ways, it's like, you know, there's an egocentric label that is attached to it. And for the longest time, even when I went to live in California, you know, where everybody called themselves an artist, I found it very difficult to use it. But it is an occupation. It's only a job. But it's a job that is fantastically free. And I think the navigation of it, when you make a piece of work that triggers something in your being that is about excitement, that is what makes you want to go on and make the next piece. And hopefully the viewer then has some response that might be similar or dissimilar, that is about desire and passion. And that can be manifested in many different ways. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Some of the work I do is uncomfortable. I used to always say that in being uncomfortable, it's about showing something what they haven't seen before, something they have not seen before. So it might take on the skin of a cow or the skull of a human, but all references are human bodies on this planet for this very short period of time. Before we access something much bigger. And my frustration, I think, is the desire to access it right now and that impossibility. So what I try and do, I think, is have elements collide, almost like in some kind of notion of the physics, or where molecules kind of erupt in a different way and maybe land in a different way. And that doesn't mean people are going to like the work. They're not. And what I'm going to do tonight, actually, too, is I'm going to probably bombard you, even though I'm only going to show you 30 pieces of work. Some of them are quite intense, and you will be seeing them non-chronologically and all at the same time, you know, whereas in fact they span 25 years or 30 years. So Alan is very kindly going to run my PowerPoint for me. So we'll begin with the first slide, which is a photograph. And this is in the very early days of computers. I was asked to make a project in the maternity hospital in Dublin. And I won't go into the details, but I had this sudden image when I was looking at an X-ray of an adult skull, that the fetal position of a baby in the womb is very similar to the position of the brain space in our skulls. So on computer, we set an X-ray of a baby into the space of an adult skull. And for me, I often talk about icons in terms of, I think of an icon actually as something that gives you hope and despair and possibility all at the same time. So some people look at this and they don't see the baby at all. And in fact, to x-ray a baby, you can't x-ray a live baby. So this was an x-ray of a dead baby that I got access to in the hospital. And you can see its beautiful little skeleton. But it's about conception and death. And at the time I was doing it, I was looking at that notion of the first thing we inherit when we're born is our own mortality. But there is a nurturing that goes on between that little fetal position and the elder skull that is symbiotic. But at the same time, it's leading towards mortality and life. But also the notion of concept, you know, to be conceived in the womb, there's also that notion of being conceived in terms of idea and conceptual idea, which for me is terribly exciting. And I don't have the type of brain that is retentive, you know, I'm not an intellectual, but for a period of time, sometimes things make sense in terms of words, but then they always go back into the visual, which for me is more powerful. We go to the next slide, please, Alan. If you hear squeaks, my dog is actually squeaking her toy next to me on the sofa. Good girl. This piece, I'm very fond of this one. It's a Bible that was in our family, but it was I never knew it as a child, and it's about 4 or 5 inches thick. And when my mother was older, she always just let me take these things and put them in my studio. And for ages, they would just sit around. And then one day I decided to drill a hole in the Bible from cover to cover. I didn't quite know why. And very often that's the starting point for work, is that I don't know why. Excuse me. And so it was terribly difficult to drill. I phoned up laser cutters who said, no, we're not going to destroy the Bible. A laser would have left a burning mark. So the physicality of it was that I got a Black & Decker cookie cutter drill and drilled inch by inch through the Bible. And what happened was that you had this beautifully silky, smooth hole that ran from cover to cover. And it actually didn't destroy the Bible. But at the time, I didn't know why I had done it. And all my academic friends who used to hang around in those days, this is a long time ago, it's probably, you know, the early 90s, I would discuss the work as was kind of in the studio, and I opened it at this page and it made sense, because this is the point where the 2 Marys are at the tomb of Jesus and the hole has landed where their hearts are. And they are totally bereft and saddened by the loss of their, inverted commas, savior, beloved, etc. So what I felt as I was in that period of my life was, and being brought up a Catholic, I was brought up a Catholic in Cork, in a lay school, Miss Sullivan's School on the South Mall, which didn't have nuns and priests, but still, you know, taught through Catholicism, was that there was a great sadness that the body of Jesus was gone when he was crucified and put in the tomb, and then he rose up into heaven, that was the removal of the body. And then the crisis that occurred in the Catholic Church was that we were forced, I felt, to believe that the body was bad. So what's happened here is that you've almost reinvested a physicality into this Bible. Also, it's not desecration, it's not iconoclastic. You can still read the words. So for me, it made sense. And for me, it became a complete piece of work because of that. Next slide, Alan, please. Shows a close-up of the whole. And the engravings are very, very beautiful. And one more, Alan, please. The deposition of Christ. So that, you know, pieces like that, at the time when I made them, I actually called the entire show Inheritance. And the skull with the fetal skeleton, the Bible, several different pieces would interact with each other. The next slide, please, Alan. This piece I don't know if you can read it just from the slide. It's very, very hard when you're on a Zoom and you can't see these things physically. But this is actually a kiss taken between two people's mouths. There's a dental rubber called alginate that some of you might have had when you were getting, you know, teeth guards or whatever taken in the dentist. And it's made from seaweed, and you can put it into two people's mouths and ask them to kiss. And what occurred was that where the tongues met, there was a hole. And that hole is the point of most intense intimacy. So when they removed their mouths from the kiss, I took the rubber out and then had to make a mold from wax and then cast it in silver. And it was made actually for an exhibition in Holland called Strangers in a Train. And it hung in the middle of this carriage where there might have been this opportunity of lovers to meet and to kiss and to leave. But this, how do you manifest a kiss? Again, this is about the impossibility. Film is one of my favorite things in terms of art or an art form. I guess because it's created by light and it disappears. What I'm doing is the opposite, actually. I wonder why I didn't do film instead. But this is almost like the skeleton of a kiss. So it has the imprint of the lips and the palate and the teeth, but where the lips actually pressed most intimately is a hole. And I realized at the time there were lots of holes in my work, from the Bible to the kiss, etc., etc. Next one, Alan, please. This is a later work, and for the longest time, I worked with cow skins, and I was looking at kind of gender and power, and I'm not showing you any of those tonight, actually, and a lot of people would know that work best. This is a piece called Table Telescope, and it's a little cast iron version of one of my mother's tea tables that she had in her living room. We were kind of bourgeois Cork, brought up in Montenotte. And I had it cast in iron beautifully. And then above it, suspended on a little tiny thin wire, is a telescope looking down into the top of a human skull. Next shot, Alan, please. And actually, funnily enough, when I was living in Dublin, in a basement flat with hardly any money and, you know, scrabbling along, I used to go into, jump into dumpsters and skips to find things. And I found this marbled box that was like a hat box. And I knew actually at the time that it was a skull box because my Aunt May, who lived in Montenotte, was a pathologist, and she had these in her house. And there were educational skulls used in UCC for showing medical students, you know, the anatomy. So I had found this perfect skull, and at the time, I sold it for €100 because I was going traveling. So I rang up my friend and asked, could I have the skull back? And then gilded the inside of it and placed a meteorite in it. Next slide, please, Alan. So this is much more recent piece, actually, and I had not gone near the actuality of a human bone, and felt quite, I guess, afraid of it. But when I was when I discovered that box with this skeleton in it, and then 25 years later started working with human bones, there was it felt like it had to be made more sacred. So what I did was gilded the inside of the skull with pure 18-karat gold, so that you have this sense of kind of reliquary. And the idea of this piece is very much how it sums up a lot of what I think in terms of our body and the universe. So what occurs here is that you have the telescope looking down into this human skull that's gilded on the inside. And inside that, a meteorite, which has come from outer space and landed into our Earth space. And then the skull, our bodies are dead, and possibility of them moving out into another territory. So it was about the joining together of these things. So for me, it's an icon of that union, but it doesn't attempt to depict anything more wonderful in terms of the spiritual. And that's a few years ago, I got onto Tim Thurston, who used to do that wonderful program on Lyric, music program. And I asked him about music of the voice of God, like had there any of the brilliant composers like Bach, Handel, etc., composed for the voice of God? And he actually couldn't come up with anything. Now, of course, we have, you know, the great masses and everything, but usually they're disciples or people singing towards the notion of God. And generally speaking, like works, physical works or visual works, they really, it's an impossibility because we don't know, it's impossible to envisage. So what I try and do is bring together things that are sacred, like that skull once, you know, had a brain of a person that lived on this planet. So it is in its own way sacred, but it's still now passed on into a whole different other time, if that makes sense. The next slide, please, Alan. When I show those works, you know, you're seeing, they might be surrounded by photographs, sometimes of landscape. It's almost like phrasing. So you put them in a gallery and you go from one thing that might be more complex and crystalline, and then go into something that's, it is like something, you know, words that are less powerful. So what I'm showing you here, I'm taking them out of their context and pitching them one against the other, just to try and maybe show you ones that attempted to do something in the direction of the unknown more than others. This piece is called Fulgurite. It's a little silver hand cast in the lost wax cast process of a little boy I know. And sometimes when lightning hits sand, it vitrifies and it creates this physical tubes that are actually like vitrified lightning. Next slide, please, Alan. So it's like this crystalline tube, and they're found in deserts, and you can actually make them yourself. I read on YouTube where if you can run these incredibly hot currents through sand and you can make fulgurites. So in this particular case, it's like, you know, some kind of notion of the energy of thunder and lightning connecting with the body, but also the center of the palm of the hand, which is one of the most powerful points of our bodies. But again, it's reduced to something static. And it's about the imagination making that leap into the territory of the greater thing. Next, please, Alan. This piece came from, I love it. This is one of my favorite things we ever did. It was actually shown first in a brewery in Cork, in that wonderful Beamish and Crawford brewery, which I regret has been knocked down into apartments, and could have been fantastic as a mini turbine hall in Cork City for projections like this. I was asked to do something in Chichester Cathedral. Sometimes artists are invited for kind of competitions to propose sculptures in wonderful places. And I hardly ever win them, but occasionally do. But this particular situation, Chichester Cathedral in the south of England, it's the closest, or I think you can see the sea from it. And it's got this wonderful high ceiling. And at the time I thought, let's try and create a stalactite to actually naturally form within the cathedral, which was nuts because, you know, we'd all be dead and gone. It would be millions and millions of years to grow. But at the time I was researching these stalactites, I discovered the second biggest stalactite in the world is in the Doolin Cave in County Clare. And this is it. It's this spectral, singular, fabulous white thing that was only found, I think, in the 60s by cavers. So the people who owned it, who, you know, it's open to the public, very kindly allowed me to record a little boy singing below the stalactite. And he's a boy called Ben Escorcio, who I had heard singing in a choir in County Clare. And I found him and I asked him, his voice was just about to break, and I asked him, would he be willing to sing under this stalactite? The idea being about time, this beautiful, pure voice. I asked him to sing notes that were not referencing the music. So it was like it was like pre-music. Felt very ancient. And he just had his little naked torso and his lower body going into darkness underneath this 7-meter tall stalactite. So it was about geological time meeting human time. And in some ways, that's the most enormous thing we have to kind of make us feel smaller than our egos sometimes shove us into. And I'm looking at a very old mountain out the window here, Wheelwright Mountain in County Mayo. And at the moment, I have begun actually working more with stone, which I'll talk about later. Next slide, please, Alan. That just shows a clearer photograph of Ben below it. And the people were incredibly kind. They let us build a platform so we didn't damage the stalagmite. And then he could stand on that and we recorded it. This piece is called Everest Shark. I adore sharks, and I've made a lot of work around the animal. And it's a much maligned animal. In some ways, I think it epitomizes our human fear of our own mortality. And I was asked to make a piece for a show in England in a place called Croft Castle that had this little old church on the grounds. But the wonderful thing about doing shows that aren't in galleries is that you have much more, it's much richer. You have the history of the place, you have so much more than you have in a white cube. And in this particular case, there was an Iron Age fort up on a hill behind Croft Castle. And so what I was looking at the notion of time, and this is the first piece that I really looked at the age of the shark. You know, the shark existed on this planet 400 million years ago, and then evolved to its present form 100 million years ago, and has not needed to evolve since. Human beings are busy decimating them. You know, the Malaysians, the Chinese still fin sharks. They chop their dorsal fins and their pectoral fins off and throw them alive back into the sea. It's an abomination. There are a lot of people on Instagram now that are doing fantastic work to try and get people to respect the animal more. So in some ways, it's about survival, it's about relationship. And in this particular case, I looked at the age of Mount Everest, and Mount Everest rose to its peak around 60 million years ago. So in fact, the shark is much older than Mount Everest. And what we did here was where the dorsal fin normally is, we cast an exact replica of Mount Everest, carved by a CNC machine on computer so that, topographically it's accurate. And then I went to great lengths to find a shark without having one killed. And that's the other side of being an artist. You have these mad kind of, endeavors running around the countryside to find a shark. And a guy called Patsy Morgan up in the north was a friend of mine, and sharks are now not allowed to be sold for food, which is fantastic in Ireland, whereas in the past they were. So I phoned him up and he said he had some in his freezer. So he said, what do you want? And I said, ideally a blue shark about 2 meters long. And he said, I'll phone you back on Monday. And he had a blue shark in his freezer, 2 meters long, that he wouldn't have been able to sell. So I went to pick it up in a roundabout outside Dublin, frozen stiff, brought it to a foundry. We make a mold, cast it in wax, then do lost wax casting and cast it in bronze. The reason being that, I wanted this metal shark that would kind of reference the Iron Age fort, and we patinated it in this rusty color. And it lay on the floor of this old church that had this lovely basic crucifix on the wall. Next slide, please. But that shark has been shown in different places, and obviously when it's in that little church, it has a different, it's an invasion in ways. It's a mad kind of stranding, but that kind of theatre that occurs brings up a lot of other notions, which are sometimes obliterated by the whiteness, and sometimes it's necessary to obliterate the noise or confusion of the surroundings. And the gallery, of course, can give you that. It can give you that calm. This was a piece actually made with a real shark that was bought in the Cork market before the prohibition on selling them for food. And a friend of mine who owns a restaurant kept the meat for his restaurant, and I pickled the skin. It was for an exhibition in the Bloomberg space in London, which is all about the value of money. And so I gilded the inside of this poor unfortunate shark with pure gold. And then we suspended it on threads in this dark room. So it was almost like going on a night scuba dive, that you kind of, it was lit from underneath and it gleamed. And I tried to reform him as best as I could into the shape of a living animal. But you did have this kind of ragged abomination at the same time that is, again, like the dome of the human skull is imbued with value because of the gold and the purity. And alchemically, of course, gold being a very valuable and pure mineral. Next, please, Alan. There are links. They mightn't seem like it, but there are links between these works. This piece was done in Lismore in County Waterford. Some of you might have seen it. There's a wonderful art centre in Lismore. The castle is owned by William Burlington, whose father owns Chatsworth in England. And he has set up an art centre in a wing of Lismore Castle. And there's a little Unitarian church in the village that they also use as a gallery. So I was invited to make a piece of work there. I went into the space and I saw those rounded windows. And I had seen these old cast iron baths in a junkyard that mirrored the shape of the windows. So I went rushing off and bought 9 cast iron bathtubs and set them on the floor of the gallery. And in the wall below the window, I set a little marble tabernacle. And inside that is the eye of a shark. Now, again, brutal in ways, when they were skinning the shark in the Cork market, obviously the eyes were removed and the guts were removed, and I kept an eye. And I set it in a tiny golden box and put it in the tabernacle below the windows. The tabernacle mirroring the shape of the windows mirroring the shape of the baths. And so in some ways that the eye of this strange animal that most people hate was in the position where the body and blood of Christ would be in a Catholic church. And then the congregation, in inverted commas, of bathtubs, I gilded inside them a scum line of pure gold, so that those baths would have been occupied by hundreds of people over hundreds of years that would have cleansed their bodies. And at the time, a residue of their dead skin and dirt would have accumulated. But somehow some transformation has occurred where it's now a scum line of pure gold. So again, it's about this alchemical transformation, an absence of the occupants from the bathtubs, but maybe some kind of resonance of the presence of many, many people over years. And next one, please, Alan. You can see here there were all different old bathtubs. The guy in the junkyard was very happy when he saw me coming. And you can see the gold lines along the edge. This piece then, I then showed again in Fritz Street Gallery in London and added a few more bathtubs, but it really worked best in Lismore. Again, in this the space is now neutral in a way, but it has these beautiful colored panes of glass. Next, please. That just shows you. They were very beautiful, the insides of them were like paintings themselves. They had scrapes and scars and peeling paint. And then it was an old man in Germany who makes this gold powder, and he's in his 70s, and I don't know how I found him, but I phoned him up, and he sells these tiny vials of powdered gold, which if you sneezed, like you would lose many, many euros in a flash. Next one, please, Alan. So leaping forward to Carrara, in about 2008, I visited this studio in Carrara in Italy. Carrara being the town where Michelangelo made most of his sculptures out of pure white marble called Statuario. And there's a wonderful studio called Studio Carlo Niccoli, where I'm still working actually at the moment, run by a woman called Francesca Niccoli, whose parents, you know, for hundreds of years made white statues and sculptures. These plaster molds like the David and those around the back are just residue of other people working there. But I had an idea to make a little bed, and it took me 10 years to get the money to do it actually, because at the time I had no money. And then a woman in England funded it. And the idea was that I would make this tiny little single bed that has a pillow and disheveled sheets. So it looks like maybe someone has occupied the bed for a short period of time. So there's an impression in the pillow of a head and the sheets are pulled back. So what I do is I go to Italy with, you know, a few sheets and a pillow, and I make a model. And then these extraordinary craftsmen copy it in the same old way that they would have made Michelangelo's David, with point systems to get depth and impressions. Next one, please, Alan. And then it was brought to this place, Roche Court in England, and shown in the garden of Madeleine Besbre's house. She's got this wonderful sculpture garden. But it was a beautiful thing. It was a mixture of innocence, like birth, death, sex, all these things, and yet none of them in a way. So it was quite tomb-like, but the folds were so perfectly made that it looked like you could pop in for a little snooze. Next, please, Alan. That shows you the quality of, this is not Statuario, it's a Carrara marble, so there's gray in it, and I think that was after rain. But you can see the beauty of the workmanship. They carve it like butter, it's extraordinary. Next one, please, Alan. So Mount Everest kind of followed through from the shark, and I decided that there was this big block of marble outside the door of the studio. So I asked, could we use it? And then we cast, it's like an erratic. So on top of this giant white marble block, we cast an exact replica of Mount Everest. Now, in this case, normally you would make a model, but in this case, I had a mathematical CNC machine carve it so that it's accurate to the planet. So that would have been carved from the top by a robot, and then humans take over. It's the only time I ever go towards the robotics. But I think necessary to be accurate in terms of this diminutive, it's like kind of some Lilliputian view of Everest. Next, please. And here you can see, and the background is so exquisite, you know, plaster cast of, you know, Michelangelo again. And then the way Christian, this Frenchman, carved Everest and connected it to the boulder. Next, please. Working in the studio is just madly, you know, it's now UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is fantastic that someone has realized how important the studio is. And they go in there, you know, cutting every day, dust everywhere, and you know, and there's no, it still functions, and that's what makes it more beautiful. It's not just a museum. This then is the Everest erratic when it arrived back to Ireland and was shown in the Irish Museum of Modern Art on kind of ugly looking concrete base, but they were afraid, they said it needed a base. For me, this was, you know, you had this mixture that was almost like an iceberg, and that collision between stone and ice, but also the physical relationship with the little mountain. Is when you were standing at my height, 5'7", your nose was kind of level with the peak of Everest, and you had this wonderful kind of disembodied relationship with it in a funny way, which maybe that's the whole attempt, is it? The disembodiment to get closer to some kind of notion of the imagination or something indescribable. Next, please. And these are called blue feet, or no, blue walk. And at the moment, my new works actually I'm doing involve feet. And I'm working with a new marble called Damascus Rose, which is like a slice of flesh. In this particular case, it's a block of blue sodalite that comes from Brazil. And I just set these feet as if they were walking on top of this rock. But again, it's about time and compression and in some ways integration in terms of body and land. And what I'm hoping to do with the Damascus Rose, we're working on a giant block that's eight tons actually. And there's going to be this struggle of feet on top, because Damascus Rose obviously is Syrian essentially, but runs in a seam across North Africa, where people for millennia lived and now are being dispossessed and forced to leave and migrate. So you have this fracture also between their feet and the earth. I went to the Petrie Museum a couple of years ago in London, which is this wonderful small museum of Egyptian artifacts. He was an archaeologist. And there's one whole cabinet full of feet just broken. So the bodies would have been really, you know, savaged and broken and taken away and given to museums. But there's something so incredibly persistent and beautiful of these, about these flat Egyptian feet still connected to the pedestal or earth that they were kind of first made in. Next, please, Alan. You can see here it's beautiful. It's very like lapis lazuli, but lapis comes in smaller seams and it's much more valuable. Sodalite has a less romantic name, but has this wonderful mixture of colors. Next, please, Alan. So this is hot out of the oven, this one. I was there last week, and this is Damascus Rose. And I nearly cried when I saw it. It's because when it's not polished, it's a pale pink. And then this one actually was covered in water. I just poured water on it, but we've polished it since. And a few years ago, I made 2 pillows after making the bed that had impressions of the head. But on one, there was a right ear, and on the other was the left ear. And I called it Listen, Listen. And they were in Greek marble, which is white. And that was very much about just, I suppose, poetically, for want of a better word, in terms of title, asking ourselves to listen to something, you know, that is ancient, which is in this case stone. But what occurred here with the Damascus Rose was absolutely accidental. Again, carved by Christiane, who's a brilliant carver. Those veins that ran along into the ear they're like a slice of flesh. Now, a friend of mine was a bit disturbed by it because he said he thought it was kind of gruesome. But for me, again, it is like listening to your own body as well as listening to the land we stand on. And that accident of nature just adds to it in a way. It's like the blood is flowing into the ear. And you never know what you're going to find in the middle of a block of stone. It reveals itself whichever way it wants to. Next, please. Now, this is the last piece I'll talk about. And some of you might have seen this in Cork in September 2019 as part of a festival called Sounds from a Safe Harbour, run by a wonderful woman called Mary Hickson, who used to run the Opera House in Cork and now and I would call her kind of a creative enabler of work. She's, without any fuss, she just makes things happen. She is the kind of person you want to be living with you the entire time. Because as an artist, the way I work, I can come up with ideas that seem impossible. A bit like putting the stalactite in the church, but then you go and you film it with the little boy under it. They can move into new forms. But with Mary, she said to me in about 2018, would I like to do something on a Navy ship? And I said, I actually 10 years earlier with Fiona Shaw, my friend who's an actor from Cork, we were going to do something with the Navy connected to Spike Island, for Cork 2010, I think it was called. She didn't want to do a theatre, and I didn't particularly want to do a gallery show. So we decided, we came up with this idea that we'd do this madly kind of various mixture of performance, projection, and I thought we would put an opera singer on the Navy ship. So anyway, that never happened, because actually at the time, the Minister for Defence said nobody could land on Spike Island. So that was all scuppered. So this time I said to Mary, absolutely, would love to do something on a Navy ship. And the idea was to borrow a human heart. And again, in describing these things, they're terribly simple. You think that these are terribly simple. Why should anyone have any problem with these ideas? Borrow a human heart. I thought I could zoom up to UCC, any university in Ireland, where they've hundreds and thousands of hearts that have been donated for anatomical education, and borrow one respectfully for a day to put on a ship. No way. No way. All the rules and regulations now, you can't touch any of these things, even though they're there getting dusty. But I had seen this heart on the screen now in a show in London, in the Wellcome Trust. And at the time, this was several years earlier, I found in Cork in 1856. And so I got onto the Wellcome Trust, discovered it was part of the Pitt Rivers collection. General Pitt Rivers had been in Cork at the time as a member of the British Army. This was found without any name or gender or anything in a crypt under Christchurch in Cork City. He acquired it as he was acquiring many, many things for his kind of cabinet of wonders, which is now the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. So I got onto them in Oxford. I asked, could I borrow their heart? And they said no. And then they said yes. Then they said no. It went on for like, I don't know how many years. And eventually we rented the heart. And two curators brought it over in a little box. They wouldn't allow us have it exposed on the ship, but we had a heart. The idea was that a Navy ship would come up the river in Cork. Actually, next slide, please, Alan. And the heart would be on board. The Navy were fantastic. A Captain, Brian Fitzgerald, who's since retired, allowed us hitch a ride when the ship was coming up into the center of Cork anyway, put the heart on board, and then have a friend of mine called Lisa Hannigan, who's one of the most beautiful singers in the world, sing on board. And she would be the only visible person wandering around the deck. Now, this ship had actually saved over 18,000 people in the Mediterranean when they were there for 3 years. I think courtesy of the Italian government. I think it was funded by the Italians. I'm not sure about that. But so it had already this history of saving people. Meanwhile, thousands of hearts would have landed on the bottom of the Mediterranean unseen and unsaved. But Lisa Hannigan has this song called Prayer for the Dying. And the first time I heard her singing it, I could not believe how beautiful it was. It's like an anthem to life and to death. And the refrain in the song, and we'll play a little bit of music in a minute, which is a mixture of that. But later on, you should Google her singing Prayer for the Dying, Lisa Hannigan. The refrain is your heart, my heart. So I wanted her to be wandering around the ship, just wearing one of those thermal blankets, as if she'd been left behind, or she'd be some ghost of some, migrant presence. And we recorded half an hour of music in London a couple of years earlier before we managed to get the heart, where I asked a glass harmonica player called Alistair Malloy and Lisa, and we mixed together her song Prayer for the Dying with like her idea of coming in with My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, going into Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, kind of haunting just the kind of rhythm of that behind. And as it came up past Blackrock Castle, up the River Lee to dock in central Cork, this pulsed out of the ship on speakers. So it was like this giant, big, strange kind of jukebox of kind of ethereal music. We had a beautiful sunny day. We didn't know till 2 days before whether Cork port authorities would allow us to do it. They put on their silly, institutional, annoying, well, in the end we got it, but we didn't know till very close to the time that we were going to be allowed to do this. Then it docked. The next one, please, Alan. Here's Lisa with her little blanket as she kind of wandered around the ship. She's also an exquisitely beautiful person. Next one, please, Alan. The crew then, as we came up, they obviously had to do their jobs, and they were fantastic. You know, they were like some kind of coordinated, you know, in my mind, like Pina Bausch dance troupe, but in fact, they were just naval boys and girls doing their job. In fact, the captain coming up the river that day was a woman. Next, please. And the reason it was important to harbour it in the Navy ship, and I want to do more work with the Navy, is it's that mixture between destruction and defence. Yes, they have guns on them, but the Irish Navy have never shot a gun in warfare, ever. You know, we still hold on to our neutrality, etc., etc. But it's almost like it was like a protector for the heart itself. But also it was bringing that into a territory that it normally wouldn't be considered. And then Lisa's song, Prayer for the Dying, almost, you know, gave it life when we docked. I came up the river with her. We had a sound engineer on the ship. And then when it docked, she performed. Next, please. Then luckily people did hear word of mouth, and we had a lovely crowd, and the swallows were flying over the bow of the ship, and it was just magic. And what was lovely for me is we came up the river past where I was brought up in Montanati. I could actually see the house, and everything seemed so familiar that it was really kind of, yeah, you know, kind of nostalgic for me. And I think, you know, I think we might be at the video now, Alan, which is only a minute long. But if it's possible to play it, it will give you an idea. Oh, here's Lisa just as she performed. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Alan. So that's a very wobbly little mobile phone video, but that was the actual recorded version of Your Heart, My Heart. So that's actually it on the visual material. But I was going to actually, I have a little quote here, Leonardo da Vinci. Where the spirit does not work with the hand, there is no art. So I think, you know, some writers talk about energy, you know, that they're channeling or whatever, you know, I'm not sure, you know, maybe it is about channeling, but it certainly is about a certain energy that feels very precious and at times difficult, but terribly pleasurable and exciting when you feel things come together, if that makes sense. So I know I spoke a long time and I might have exhausted you. if you have any questions, I'm totally happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dorothy, so much. You haven't exhausted me anyway. It was just so interesting. And I've learned so much more about you and your work and the way your work comes into being.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I'm Jane Killingbeck. I'm a volunteer on the Elders for Earth steering committee as well. So hi, everybody. Please put your questions in the chat box or wave furiously at me, and or else if you want to just speak. As Dorothy says, questions are so helpful in seeing her work in different ways. So there's a question here from Mary first saying, Dorothy, when you listen to the land we stand on, what do you hear?
What do I hear? Well, maybe I hear feet at the moment. I think it's, you know, I wish I heard handle or back, because sometimes I think, you know, as a visual artist, we're only trotting after people that make music. So I suppose the answer is maybe I hear nothing, but then I'm fed by those other brilliant people. I'm, of course, I think like many other people, I'm desperately saddened. You know, I went out fishing this summer and didn't catch one mackerel. You know, I saw on Channel 4 News last night, you know, those people in the Faroe Islands who massacred 1,500 dolphins for some machismo, egocentric, ridiculous notion of culture. So, you know, anyway, I could go on forever around that. So I think actually the question is, what should we listen to? That's a difficult thing. It's like, how can we direct ourselves to hear what is positive and progressive? Because largely what we hear is negative and not progressive. But then, you know, I don't know if you have this thing, there's a wonderful little app that you can get called Shazam. And occasionally I hear pieces of music and I don't know what they are. And you can put your little app on and it tells you what it is, like identifying a flower. And still there are things that are undiscovered, thank God, because if there weren't, there would be very little hope. And, you know, I have a dog and I have a horse and I have a vegetable patch and I have the sea at the end of the land. So I'm incredibly lucky. So that's what you listen to, actually. And the petrification of the stone in some ways is predictive. It's what's going to occur to us in terms of our bodies. So again, what I tried to talk about earlier, I think, in terms of accessing anything greater than that, is the beauty I see in the little red pillow is the only source. Maybe that's what you hear. How can you hear beauty? And, you know, Baudelaire said, and I'm always saying it over and over again, he said, beauty is always strange. And does that mean it's unexpected? Does that mean it's something you haven't seen before? But it also means that it's limited. And I haven't spoken about limitations, but limitations are desperately frustrating.
Thank you. And there's another question here from Frank Dawes. He says, thank you for so much beauty. Is the background knowledge behind the work, for example, knowing about the rose stone seen across North Africa, having been walked on by so many people, an intrinsic part of the work?
Yes, you know, yes, Frank. Like I was in the studio in Carrara with Francesca, and I spent a lot of time digging around in her yard and finding pieces of stone. And she said that is Damascus rose, and I thought, oh my God, you know, the road to Damascus, the poetry of the name. So that would be a trigger, if you know. And then I kind of go crazy and start imagining how that the resonance of that and can function in terms of access. Like, it's so beautiful. I think I'm having a show in London in January if these pieces get finished, and I'm going to call it Damascus Rose, because in itself it's ambiguous and not and beautiful. So it's about triggers. So yeah, if I had never heard about Damascus Rose, I probably wouldn't have gone down that road. But I think the hope in life is that you will engage with things that will. It's like meeting people sometimes, a delightful person or a fantastic film that can lead you down some tributary. Isn't it about possibility? And then again, you just worry, you know, will they dry up and will there be no more tributaries? But I think we have to kind of, in some ways, force it, and that's easier said than done. You know, months can go by and I think, oh my God, I'm never going to make anything again. And then you resist. I think one can resist reading the beautiful poem or resist sitting and watching the beautiful film. But usually there's always some solace there or that will trigger something. And one has to believe that, I think. And it is, yeah. You know, I was thinking earlier, you know, the conflict is, should you write the script? If I was a different person, you'd have a lovely, balanced, written script here. But and because I don't have that kind of brain, I can't do that. But it's about, you know, a practice. And art in some ways is like a practice. It's not necessarily a meditation, but you could think about it in that way, because things spring out from nowhere, unexpectedly, and it, you know, practice leads to maybe some sense of accumulation and richness and learning and wisdom. If we hope. So if one can keep that up, and see other work that is extraordinary, you know, unfortunately you have to delve these days, because it's hard to find new work in any of the territories that is going to feed your heart, you know. And you know, my work isn't directly political, but when I heard the word Damascus Rose after doing the hardship with Mary Hickson and Lisa and Brian Fitzgerald, it just fit in. It's kind of like fitting in like the next little piece of the jigsaw puzzle that might lead to something else. And it doesn't always. Sometimes it stops dead. I have an idea for another ship, and it looks like it's blocked, because sometimes when you have to involve other authorities and human beings, they think you're crazy, and they don't want to give it time. It's not even that they think you're crazy. There's a little bit of fear around art. I think a lot of people are afraid of visual art because they think they don't understand the language to talk about it, which is true. And there's such a load of rubbish written around a lot of art, that I'd be with most people on that. And it's a shame. And also the market has also kind of contaminated the visual art world and made it something that isolates people because it's so overpriced. So, you know, it's hard to navigate. It's hard to navigate, and sometimes maybe it's hard to navigate in the studio. And I say to students whenever I meet them, you know, I'm not sure it's that different. I'm 65 now than when I was 25. It's still allowing oneself to believe and have faith. And actually along the way, you know, when I came back to live in Ireland after being away for 10 years, Patrick Murphy gave me a show in the Douglas Hyde Gallery, which is still one of my favorite spaces in Ireland. You go in from above down into this kind of well of space in Trinity College. And he had faith. And I said to him, you know, I can't, it's too big. It's too big a space, I can't do it. And he just said, yes, you can. So it comes from, it's not only, you know, it comes from the material, it comes from other people. And it comes from some kind of inspiration, which again is another word that people are afraid to look at. But, you know, why else would you do anything? You know, you grow daffodils for the same reason, you know.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lovely comment here from Maura O'Donoghue saying, you have melted the boundary for me between the thinking brain and the dangerous imagination in the direction of creation.
Lovely, lovely, thank you.
That's beautiful.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
And other comments as well. Sort of, one person says gobsmacked, which is very nice, I thought.
Said what, sorry?
Gobsmacked.
Somebody was waving there, Jane.
Okay, whoever, sorry, I can't see everybody at once. Whoever's waving, just unmute yourself if you, yeah.
Or maybe not.
Who was that?
I thought I had someone wait. I thought some.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was.
Mary O'Connell. You have to unmute yourself, Mary.
Okay, I just thank you so much. This was an absolute joy. And I was so glad that you didn't have this thing written out. It was spontaneous and beautiful and just brought us into the moment. And I have no words. It was just a treat. And please don't apologize. I just felt that there was a whole panoply of culture unrolled in front of us. So thank you 1,000 times.
Oh, well, thank you, Mary. Thank you.
So There's a question here. How does your creative life enable you to handle your feelings in the face of the climate and biodiversity crisis?
Well, I probably referenced it there a little bit a minute ago, but it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And I try to be active as much as I can. And then sometimes you kind of just get jaded and think, oh, you know, we thank God we lived in the time we lived, the poor younger generation. But I still kind of, you know, last night I wrote to the Danish embassy, I wrote to the Faroe Islands after seeing those dolphins being killed. You know, I think that kind of activity is important too, to put your voice out there. But I wish there was more ways to do that, you know. Is that answering the question? I don't know. And, you know, sometimes, like a few years ago, like COVID in the beginning for me was fine. It gave me time to relax, actually, and be here without jumping on a plane or something, which isn't very good for the environment. But the second COVID block was very dark, because I live on my own. I have a dog and I have a horse, and I realize I thrive on the energy of going to cities and working and then coming back. But whether that can continue the way, already it feels like it's ruptured. I was in Italy last week. It was the first time the studio had opened since COVID, and it felt so strange, and I was the only artist there, and maybe the deflation, you know, one hopes that maybe it'll grow back in a better way, but maybe it won't. You know, it's hard. It's so hard to tell yet. It's so hard. But the demise of nature is the one that I listened to that wonderful woman who worked with chimpanzees last night on Instagram, Jane Goodall, and you know, she was talking about science and how, because she's a scientist, but she was talking about the head and the heart and how science really needs to shift and include the heart as well as the head. Because I have done projects with my brother who's a scientist, and we did a film about a woman called Maud Delap who lived on Valentia Island and bred jellyfish. And we went to Australia to film these jellyfish. And I spent my time getting terribly excited, going around with a microphone and wanting the scientists to say, I don't know. But they would never say, I don't know. They would always say, at this moment in time, it is unknown. So there was this absolute kind of straitjacket of convention around the way they functioned. That's so much part of their training that it feels like, you know, there needs to be more expansion in that territory. But then, of course, scientists are hampered by the lack of funding. You know, I went to the Galapagos Islands. We were in the Darwin Research Centre, myself and Fiona Shaw doing on a residency, and they didn't have enough money to go out to this island to look at sea lions. The hub, the center of natural perfection in the world, and the scientists were hampered by that. You know, again, shocking. You know, I'm rambling. Sorry.
No, you're not rambling. It really is shocking when that happens. Maybe you could answer this. What place could art have, do you think, in helping communities develop resilience in the face of climate change?
Well, you know, I went to a national school here a couple of years ago, and I walked in and the kids all had made jellyfish and sharks out of plastic bags. And it was fantastic. And, you know, but then the other day I was in Uachtarard, and this teenager threw up a cardboard cup into the car park, and my friend saw it. So I went after him, two of them, they were drunk. There must have been a football match or something. And I said, you dropped your cup. And we then had this, oh, it's not my cup. And I said, it is. I saw it was your cup. But then the two of them, I'd say they were about 18 or 19, started saying, and my friend was thinking I'd get, you know, mugged or something, but I'm doing it more and more in this, you know, older lady kind of eccentric way. But I always try and talk to them in a way that isn't attacking them. And in the end, they started saying, sure, it doesn't matter if we throw the cup away. The whole world is going to explode. And I thought that was devastating. You know, if that's the attitude, and they weren't, you know, they were privileged enough looking kids, they might have had a beer or two. And then they thought it was the biggest joke. And I said, well, it's not a joke. And they said, our mother says that too. And it was just this unbelief. That was the first time I've ever encountered that, actually. It doesn't matter because we're all going to explode. That's really, really shocking.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Little Greta is fantastic. As Frank mentioned, Greta Thunberg, but God love her. She's, is she just being tolerated? That's the other fear, Anyway, we have to keep trying. Oh, sorry, the question was art. Yes, in the despair times, I do think art has power. I definitely do, and especially film and music. I think visual art can as well, but it's accessible in a different way. When with something like Hardship, that was just so beautiful because everything came together: music, hardware, idea, imagination, and I watched people walking their dogs down along the quay, not knowing what was going to happen. They didn't know a battleship was going to go past them with this mad magic music coming out of it. And you could see them stopping dead. It was so beautiful because it was so contrary to the nature of the ship in a way. And yet what those men and women had done in the Mediterranean was so essentially good. Like Captain Fitzgerald told us this story where one day they picked up 700 migrants in this boat that was completely sinking. And the sergeant came up to him after a while and said, Captain, we had 722 migrants on board. We now have 723. And he went and he held, this baby had been born, and he held the baby in his hands. And he said, I don't know where you've come from. I don't know where you're going, but for this moment in time, you're safe. And it was so heartbreaking, because actually, where is that little baby? Is it in some camp in Greece, or where is he, That's the other thing we don't hear. We don't hear anything about it. We hear about Afghanistan, we don't hear about Yemen. It's daunting, definitely daunting.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe in collective energy, and I think that I do believe that has power. And if something can move through from one person to another, like art does, I think that is definitely important.
Yeah. Just referring back to the story you were telling about those young people and their attitude. There's just a comment here from Teresa Gilbert. Is it a joke or is it despair that they're feeling? I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
They certainly weren't showing despair. they were
or maybe it was the result of despair.
Yeah.
That they joke about it.
Yeah.
So there's another question here from Ben Kimmerling. Where, if at all, does inspiration first enter your body? Or do you feel it comes from outside or within?
It's a mixture. I think it comes from outside, it goes in, and then goes, bingo, you kind of just have this sudden realization, that something can work. Sometimes in my studio, it can be about two things coming together, that it might have, like the shark skin hung there for 10 years before I decided to line it with gold, So, but the realization, sometimes if it's a kind of an idea where nothing physical exists, it's obviously from outside and then comes inside. But in the old days when I worked with cowskins, I'd go into the studio and every day they would kind of nearly tell me what to do because they were so grotesque and powerful at the same time. And I would tell myself, I couldn't do it now, then I had meat, I don't eat meat anymore. But it was like trying to reincarnate the cow in a way and give the cow a chance of another life or another significance. And that's one thing I'm very interested in, is that things are not set in stone, to contradict myself almost from earlier on, but they're not set in stone. There's always, even if you look at geology, it's about rupture, it's about, folds, it's about things are always changing. And it's sometimes interesting to look back, and at the moment we've just done the first 10 years of a website, or the most recent 10 years, and then we're doing the next 10 years, and which will be out in about a couple of weeks. If any of you want to look at it, I think it's just dorothycross.com or something. And the hardest thing is looking back at the 30 years ago and seeing whether it's got any value now. And some of it does, actually, I think, for me, you know, obviously for other people it mightn't. But yeah, some pieces still do. But then that's such a short little period of time, you know, 30 years.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for answering all those questions, as well as the presentation you gave, which was just beautiful. And as somebody said earlier, you were speaking so much from your heart and not to some written out piece, and that makes such a lot of difference, I think. Okay. And just seeing your work and hearing you talk about how you came to make those pieces is just fascinating. So thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And thank you, everybody, for being here as well and for asking such interesting questions. Our next event in this series, Spirituality in the Earth, will be on Wednesday, the 20th of October at 7 o'clock. And we will be welcoming Imam Dr. Ali Al-Saleh, I hope I'm saying that right, founder of the Al Bayt Islamic Centre in Dublin, who's going to talk about the relationship between being a Muslim and the earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks to Alan for the computer, Alan and Mary. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.